I'm Rachel Monroe, 37 years old, and I was reviewing the final layout for the reception when my phone buzzed with a message that stopped me cold. "You're not invited to the wedding. Lindsay doesn't want you there." I stared at the screen, unable to move for a moment. This was the wedding I'd planned from start to finish, paid for with my own money coordinated down to the minute, and now I wasn't welcome. The room around me felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the breath had been pulled out of it. I'd spent months making sure my sister's big day would be flawless, but I never imagined I'd be erased from it altogether. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and hit like and subscribe if you've ever given someone everything only to be pushed aside. I grew up just outside Portland, Oregon, in a small house that always smelled like wood polish and Sunday roast. My parents, Douglas and Marie, were the kind who believed in good manners, fresh-pressed clothes, and keeping emotions tucked away. My sister Lindsay came along when I was 5, and even then she seemed to pull the spotlight naturally while I was asked to hold the baby or keep my voice down. Lindsay was praised for her charm, her laugh, her energy. It wasn't that they didn't care about me, they just seemed to expect more from me and forgive more in her. By the time I was 8, I'd already figured out my place in the family. At Lindsay's birthday, she got a magician, a pony, and a towering cake shaped like a princess crown. Mine came 2 months later, a movie night with delivery pizza in the living room. I asked once why hers was so big. My mom said Lindsay was still little and needed extra sparkle. I didn't ask again by middle school. I was used to it. Lindsay could forget chores or bring home a report card full of B-minuses, and she'd get a pat on the head and a treat from the bakery. I brought home straight A's and heard, "Don't let it slip, Rachel, or we expect that from you." I focused on school joined, yearbook, and volunteered on weekends, saved up for a summer photography program that I dreamed about for years, until Lindsay fell during soccer practice and broke her arm. The insurance didn't cover everything. My parents came to me with a sad look and soft voices saying they were sorry, but Lindsay's surgery had to come first. I handed over every dollar I'd saved and let the dream go, but I found another way. I worked part-time, jobs, bought a used camera, and started building a portfolio, bit by bit. I put myself through community college, then transferred to a university, worked weddings on weekends, and eventually opened my own small event business. Lindsay, meanwhile, tried out a new major every year of college, all paid for by our parents. After graduation, she drifted from one short-term job to the next. In between, she called me needing help with rent or car repairs or her phone bill. I always gave what I could, and each time she'd laugh and say, "You're just good with money," never once did she offer to pay it back at family dinners. I brought homemade pies, helped set the table, arrived early, stayed late, but no one ever asked how my business was doing or who I was working with. Lindsay always had something bigger to share, a new boyfriend, a new job, some new crisis. I smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. Then one Sunday she walked in with a diamond ring. Her cheeks flushed with excitement and announced she was engaged. The whole room lit up. Champagne was poured. My mom cried. My dad stood to toast. I hugged her tight and smiled with everything I had over dinner. My mom turned to me like it was already settled and said, "Rachel will take the pictures. She has that lovely business. Now." Lindsay beamed and started talking about flowers and venues, like the decision had already been made. I didn't say yes right away, but when Graham's parents came by for dessert, all soft-spoken and clearly loaded, I saw Lindsay change in real time. She sat up straighter, dropped her usual slang, and started mimicking their polished tone 2 weeks later. She took me to coffee with a stack of bridal magazines and wide, hopeful eyes. She said she couldn't afford full-service vendors and that no one else could do what I do. "It would mean everything if I took it on," she said, "especially with the Fosters expecting a certain standard." I told myself this might be the turning point, that if I gave her my best, If I showed up the way I always wished someone would show up for me, then maybe things would shift. Maybe this time I'd finally feel like more than just the dependable older sister. But what I didn't realize then was that this wouldn't be the start of something better. It would be the unraveling of everything. After our coffee that day, Lindsay started calling almost every evening. She'd found more photos online, bookmarked florists and caterers, and asked if I could pull together a rough budget. When she mentioned she couldn't afford premium vendors, I offered her both photography and full planning at half my usual rate. I told myself it was a gesture, something sisters did for each other, and I hoped quietly that maybe this was the start of something more solid between us. 2 weeks later, she called in tears. Graham's parents had reviewed their budget and would only pitch in if the venue met a certain standard. Lindsay sounded defeated. I told her I'd look into it. I called a few people I knew and managed to get a deposit down on a property called Maple Hill Estate, a waterfront venue with sunset views and an outdoor terrace facing the bay. I didn't tell her that I'd paid the deposit out of my business account. I just let her believe I'd pulled off a miracle. The planning picked up pace after that. Every weekend we toured vendors or reviewed samples. I scheduled mock-up dinners, designed her wedding website, set up the RSVP system, even worked out 2 separate timelines in case of delays. I pulled extra hours at night to keep up with my regular clients and made sure nothing slipped. I was handling photography, decor, venue coordination, floral orders, and seating arrangements, everything. She started calling me the wedding whisperer in front of other people, which made me smile even when I was running on fumes. At the time, it felt worth it. One afternoon, she walked the property with me, took my hand and said she couldn't have done any of it without me. I held on to that. I didn't notice the shift until the first time Carolyn and Edwin Foster came to visit the venue. Carolyn asked about the lighting plan, then flipped through my portfolio. She smiled politely, then set it down and asked whether we'd considered an agency from San Francisco instead. They worked on my niece's gala, she said. Absolutely exquisite staging. Lindsay jumped in and defended me, saying I had more bookings than I could handle, but Carolyn just nodded and moved on. After that, she began to suggest alternatives for everything higher-end catering, a new floral designer, a different calligrapher. Lindsay started echoing those ideas. Sometimes she'd say it was just for comparison. Other times she made notes in her binder and asked me to rework the budget again just in case. Each change added costs. I didn't say much, just quietly shifted funds to keep things moving. I stopped counting the hours. The planning folder ballooned from 20 tabs to over 50. One night after we finalized the tent design, Lindsay reached across the table and said, "I don't know how I'll ever thank you." I nodded but didn't respond. I was too tired to even feel proud. Then came the bridal brunch. I thought it was going to be a planning session. I showed up early, binder in hand, only to find Lindsay already seated at a long table with champagne glasses and 6 women I didn't know well. She waved me over and called out, "Here she is, our wedding planner, and my amazing sister." Everyone clapped. I sat down. A few minutes later, Lindsay stood and raised her glass. She thanked everyone for coming, then beamed. "I'm so excited to announce my maid of honor, Julia." There was clapping again. My stomach dropped. Julia was her college roommate. Lindsay continued naming bridesmaids, ending with, "And of course my sister Rachel." I waited until the group thinned out, then pulled her aside near the restrooms. "You told me I'd be your maid of honor," I said. "We talked about it the night you got engaged." She looked surprised. "Did we?" "I honestly don't remember. I just thought with everything you're doing, it'd be easier for you to focus on the planning. Less stress, you know." Then she patted my arm and walked back inside. Later that week, she sent out details about the bridesmaid gowns, custom design, $800 each. I gently asked if that was too much to expect from the group. She replied right away, "If it's too much for you, just say so. We'll find something cheaper that doesn't clash too badly." I charged the dress to my business card and moved on. At the next bridesmaid get-together, I stepped into the kitchen to grab water and overheard Lindsay in the other room with Julia and Taylor. "Honestly, it's for the best," she said. "Rachel's so type A, she'd have made a mess of it. She's basically running the whole thing anyway, total control freak." They all laughed. "That night I called her. I heard what you said. I told her plainly." She sighed. "You're seriously upset about that? You were eavesdropping. It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." Somehow by the end of that conversation, I'd apologized. Again. 3 months before the wedding, we had a family dinner. Just the 5 of us, me, Lindsey Graham, and our parents. Most of the night was spent praising Lindsay's decisions. Her monogrammed cocktail napkins, her handmade invitation suite, the new venue she'd secured after a construction delay shut down Maple Hill. I quietly corrected that part. Actually, I found the new place, I said, called in a few favors, and paid the rush fee myself. The room went quiet. My mom forced a smile. "Well, it all came together beautifully." I tried to explain how tight the timeline had been, how the backup vendors nearly fell through, but Lindsay cut in. "Why does everything have to be about money?" My dad looked at me and said, "Your sister's under enough stress without us adding to it. Let's not ruin the evening." I excused myself early, claiming I had a client meeting, but I didn't drive home right away. I parked around the corner and sat in the dark with the windows fogged from my breath. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I wasn't ready to go back to my apartment either. All I could think was, how did we get here? And the truth is, I hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The call came just after 7 in the morning. I hadn't made coffee yet. Lindsay's voice cracked the moment she said my name. "The venue pulled out," she said. "They canceled our contract. New ownership, new policies, just like that. What are we supposed to do, Rachel?" "The wedding's ruined." I told her I'd handle it and hung up before she could say more. I sat at the kitchen table in silence for a few minutes, then opened my laptop. That day vanished into a blur of emails, calls, and spreadsheet tabs. Maple Hill had been one of the few venues in the area that fit both the budget and the Fosters' expectations. Most of the other options were already booked solid for the season. Around 6 that evening, I got a soft yes from an old client who owned a private estate just north of the city. It wasn't easy to secure. She rarely opened it for weddings, but she agreed to make an exception. The estate sat on a bluff overlooking the water, had manicured gardens, a sweeping front lawn, and a ballroom with antique chandeliers. The new cost came in nearly $8,000 higher than the original. I wired the money that night, sent over the updated plans, and waited. When I called Lindsay to share the news, she hesitated. "Isn't it kind of rustic?" she asked. I told her it wasn't rustic. It was a $7 million estate with better views than Maple Hill. "I'll check with Graham's parents," she said. Later that afternoon, she called back. Carolyn and Edwin drove past. They said it's acceptable. Carolyn thinks the gardens are a bit sparse compared to the country club, but I guess it'll do. I didn't reply. I just started updating the files. Every vendor had to be re-coordinated. Contracts revised, timelines shifted. I moved client meetings, rescheduled another event, and took on the adjustment costs myself to keep things smooth. It took 3 days to get everything back on track. About a month later, I hosted the bridal shower. I rented a waterfront restaurant with a private dining room, covered the menu decorations, and even ordered custom cookies with Lindsay's initials in gold. I arrived early to oversee the setup: garden roses, cream linens, place cards with gold edging. It cost a little over $4,000. When Carolyn walked in with Lindsay and my mom, she glanced around and said, "Very sweet. Reminds me of my niece's shower, though we used peonies. These are, what are these called again?" "Garden roses," I said. "Peonies have more presence, don't you think?" she replied, then smiled. "Still, it's charming." The rest of the afternoon blurred together. Carolyn mentioned to several guests that she'd helped pick the menu. She told someone the cocktail was her idea. Lindsay didn't correct her. In fact, she nodded along. Later, I overheard her telling a group of friends Carolyn's been such a lifesaver with the planning. Thank God for her taste. Rachel had a lot of DIY ideas, totally different vibe before. I waited until the event was over. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "It hurt to hear you downplay what I've done. I've spent months on this." She barely blinked. "You're seriously going to make this about you?" "That's weird, Rachel. It was just girl talk. Don't be so sensitive." Before I could respond, Mom came over and put a hand on my arm. "Lindsay's right. This is her time. Let the small stuff go." So I let it go. A few weeks later, I found out about the bachelorette trip through social media. Julia posted a photo of all of them in matching satin jackets, team brides stitched across the backs. Everyone's name was embroidered, except mine. I called Lindsay. She picked up quickly. "It's not an oversight," she said. "I just thought it'd be easier to keep the friend group separate. You've already got your hands full with everything else." "But I'm still technically a bridesmaid," I said. She paused. "Yeah, but you're also the planner. It would feel complicated. Some of the girls find you a bit intense." "No offense." I didn't respond. I just said, "Okay," and hung up. That week I finalized the remaining vendor payments, built out the master seating chart, arranged transportation for the wedding party, and double-checked every contract. My binder was thick with files, timelines, contacts, checklists. Every box was marked, every detail secured. Then one evening, as I was adjusting the reception layout, one last time, a message came through. It was a group thread I hadn't meant to be included on. Lindsay, our parents, Graham and his family were all on it. At the top, they were finalizing headcounts and reviewing transportation. Then Carolyn asked, "Will Rachel be present at the reception? I'm concerned about how she might behave around extended family." That's when I saw it. "You're not invited to the wedding. Lindsay doesn't want you there. Your presence would make things uncomfortable for Graham's family." That came from my mother. My father followed. "We hope you'll be mature about this. It's Lindsay's day." Finally, from Lindsay. "We still expect everything to be handled professionally. All the vendors are paid. There shouldn't be any issues." I read it twice, then set my phone down. Around me were all the plans, the boards, the receipts, the schedule on my screen. Gift bags lined up for the rehearsal dinner table, numbers laminated and labeled. Everything I had built with care now followed by 7 sentences that cut me out completely. And even then, I hadn't decided what I'd do. But I knew one thing for certain: the wedding I'd poured myself into no longer existed. Whatever happened next wouldn't be what they expected. I didn't move for a long time after reading that message. The screen on my phone dimmed, then went dark, but I could still see the words like they were stamped somewhere behind my eyes. I stood up, eventually walked out of my office, and ended up by the kitchen sink. I didn't know where else to go. My hands were cold, and I didn't know if it was from the weather or something deeper. I called Natalie. She picked up fast. "I'm coming over," she said. "Don't go anywhere." She was there within 15 minutes, walked in without knocking, looked at my face and didn't ask questions. She read the thread slowly, then set my phone down. "You're not crazy," she said. "This is wrong, all of it." I nodded, but I couldn't find the words to speak. We sat there in the kitchen for a while, both quiet. That night she stayed, turned off my phone notifications, made tea, and pulled a blanket around my shoulders while I sat curled on the couch. I didn't sleep much. My thoughts kept circling every minute I'd spent, every dollar, every decision I'd made so carefully. I kept seeing my name left off that thread. I kept hearing my mother's voice telling me to be mature. The next morning, I opened my banking app and started going line by line. I hadn't realized how much I'd taken on until I saw it all together: venue deposits, catering floral orders, furniture rentals, transportation, bridal shower rush fees. The total came in just under $47,000. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Natalie came in a little later, looked over my shoulder, then looked at me. "You've done enough," she said. Her voice was soft. I nodded, but I didn't close the app. That evening I called Ben Lieberman. He's a contract attorney I've worked with on vendor agreements over the years. I explained the situation, what I'd paid for, what I'd coordinated, what still remained. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Rachel, you're not legally obligated to complete anything. You didn't sign a contract agreeing to work for free. You fronted those costs personally. That's not recoverable, but they can't demand anything further from you." He told me to document everything, emails, spreadsheets, text threads, and back it all up. Once you've got that, you can decide what you want to do. But this is your decision now, not theirs. So that's what I did. I spent the entire next day organizing files. I saved copies of every invoice, every email chain, every change request, and updated timeline. I downloaded screenshots from messages, added notes where needed, and backed up the entire folder to 2 different drives. I didn't rush. I worked steadily, one file at a time. Something shifted while I was doing that. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't crying. I was still exhausted, but the fog I'd been in for months started to lift. There was a kind of clarity in the quiet. At the end of the night, I opened the family group thread and typed 6 words. "Then pay for it yourselves, leeches." I hit send. Then I got to work. I deleted every active wedding file, transportation schedules, vendor contact lists, seating chart layouts, menu designs, floor plans. I canceled the final credit card authorizations and notified my bank to block future charges tied to the event. I emailed every vendor I had brought in personally, let them know I was no longer the point of contact, and forwarded billing information for the Monroe Foster family. Then I blocked every number in that message thread, my parents Lindsey Graham, Carolyn Edwin. I removed them from email, social, business contacts. It was done. The silence that followed was immediate. I didn't realize how loud it had been until it stopped. Natalie was sitting on the other side of the room watching me quietly. "How do you feel?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer right away. But when I finally spoke, the words felt steady, like I'm standing up straight for the first time in years. The next morning, I woke up to missed calls and voicemails right before the blocks had gone into effect. Lindsay sounded panicked. My dad's voice was clipped. Carolyn left 2 messages referencing legal consequences, something about reputational damage and obligations unmet. I played each message once, then deleted them. I'd saved copies to my archive just in case, but hearing them didn't bother me. They felt far away now, small. Ben confirmed it later that week. "They have no grounds," he said. "You paid out of pocket. There was no formal agreement. And you made sure the vendors weren't left stranded." He told me I had done more than most people would have, and that nothing could come back to bite me. Still, the hardest part wasn't the legal side. It was the silence from my family. After years of doing everything I could to stay close, the absence stung in a different way. Natalie suggested I speak with someone, and I agreed. I started therapy the following week. The first few sessions were heavy. I talked about things I hadn't said out loud before, how I always thought that if I just gave enough, tried hard enough, loved big enough, they'd finally see me. That maybe deep down, I didn't feel like I mattered unless I was useful. Some nights I'd open a drawer and find a fabric swatch or a sticky note with cake revisions. I'd take a deep breath, throw it away, and remind myself it wasn't mine to carry anymore. Slowly, I started to imagine what came next. The first day after I cut ties, I cleaned out every cabinet in my office, tossed old linen samples, expired vendor brochures, and a box of leftover ribbon rolls I hadn't touched since Lindsay's shower. It was quiet work, no music, no calls, just the sound of paper sliding into the trash and the occasional rustle of a folder being closed for the last time. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and rewrote my client agreement from scratch. Every section was revised line by line. For the first time, I added clear terms for family clients. No discounts without a signed contract. No scope without a service list. No assumptions. I saved the document and felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, I updated my intake process. Every inquiry now started with a questionnaire. If someone submitted vague expectations, asked for freebies, or hinted at emotional pressure, I declined politely. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I just moved on. A week later, I got a message from Angela Quinn, a florist I'd worked with during the early stages of Lindsay's wedding. "Heard what happened," she wrote. "You handled it with more grace than most people I know." It wasn't long, but I read it twice. Then I closed my inbox and let myself be still for a moment. A few days after that, I met with a couple planning a spring wedding in Port Townsend. They'd found me through a referral and wanted a consult over lunch. We sat at a tasting table by the water reviewing their ideas. They asked questions, good ones, and actually listened to my process. When I explained that I reserved some weekends for rest, they didn't blink. "We're glad we found you," the bride-to-be said. "You seem like someone who really cares." I nodded and packed my things, but the words stayed with me. Later that week, Natalie came by and suggested we take a walk. We ended up at a cafe near the marina, the same one I'd used for some of Lindsay's early planning meetings. We sat outside under the heaters, shared a cinnamon roll, and passed a mug of hot cider back and forth. "You seem different," she said. I looked down at the mug. "Still tired," I said quietly. "But yeah, I think so." She studied me for a second, then asked, "Do you want to do something for yourself that weekend?" I hadn't thought about the actual wedding day yet. I'd been so focused on disconnecting that I hadn't decided how to spend it. But her question lingered. That night, I searched for short-term rentals near the coast and found a small cabin tucked into the woods just outside Callalach. 2 nights. No Wi-Fi, no phone service, just a fireplace and a narrow trail that led down to the water. I booked it. On the morning of what would have been the wedding, I woke early. The cabin was quiet, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional drip of last night's rain falling from the roof. I made coffee, wrapped myself in a thick blanket, and stepped outside. The air smelled like cedar. Everything felt still. Later that afternoon, I took my old camera and followed the trail through the woods. It opened up to a bluff overlooking the ocean gray sky, low-tide seabirds dipping near the rocks. I took a few photos just for me. Not posed, not edited, just colors and shapes and light. That night I sat by the fire and let it burn down slow. I didn't think about the reception or the ceremony or the head table I'd designed months earlier. I just watched the flames curl into ash and breathed. When I got home the next day, I had a short email waiting from my cousin Matt. We hadn't spoken in over a year. He said he'd heard about the wedding and wanted me to know he hadn't gone. It didn't feel right pretending, he wrote. "You didn't deserve that." A few days after that, my Aunt Barbara, my mom's older sister, called out of the blue. Her voice was steady, gentle. "I didn't attend either," she said. "I always saw how things were, Rachel. I just didn't know how to step in." We ended up talking for almost an hour. Nothing heavy, just small things. A book she'd read, a recipe she wanted to try. It felt easy. By the following week, I'd eased back into full-time work. I updated my branding, switched to new software, and started drafting a mentorship series for younger planners. I thought about all the times I'd struggled to set limits early on. I wanted to help someone else avoid that. My therapist called it healing. I didn't call it anything. I just kept going. The emails started to shift. Clients sent thank you notes. Vendors passed along referrals. One couple invited me to their baby shower. I hung the card they sent on the bulletin board above my desk. Each message filled a part of me I hadn't realized had been worn down. And while I hadn't heard from Lindsay not once, I no longer checked for her name. Not in my inbox, not on my phone, not in conversation. The absence didn't echo like it used to. It just was. What surprised me most was how light things started to feel again. Not all at once, but slowly, like fog lifting off a lake. And I didn't miss the version of me who had waited for a thank you that never came. About 6 months passed before I heard anything about the wedding again. I was at an industry event downtown, just a casual evening mixer for local planners and vendors, when I ran into Glenn Harper, an AV specialist I'd worked with once or twice before. We were both waiting on drinks at the bar when he leaned over and said quietly, "I heard Lindsay's wedding ended up back at the country club. Everything in-house. No outside vendors." I nodded, said nothing. He didn't press. But later that night, I found myself thinking about it again. Not in the way I used to, no heaviness or heartbreak, just a quiet curiosity. 2 days later, I got an email from Amanda Ellis, a designer I'd referred early in the planning process before things fell apart. She was working a different event at Crescent Harbor and wanted to thank me again for the original connection. "Still one of the most beautiful venues I've ever worked in," she wrote. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. I remembered the hours I'd spent securing that space, revising the floor plans, lining up every detail to make Lindsay's vision come to life, even when the vision wasn't really hers anymore. A few days after that, I received a Dropbox link from a friend in the industry. Someone had shared a small set of wedding photos from the Monroe Foster reception on social media. Out of curiosity, I opened them. It was the country club. Plain round tables, basic white linens, stock florals with uneven spacing, folding chairs, the kind they use for charity luncheons and board meetings. There was no lighting design, no focal points, no signs of the vendors I'd once had lined up. The photo of Lindsay and Graham dancing beneath a single recessed light stood out the most. No ambience, no atmosphere, just a wide-open banquet room with too much space and not enough presence. I clicked through 2 or 3 more, then closed the folder. The same afternoon, I opened my window and let some air in. It was sunny, unseasonably warm. The neighbor's wind chime moved gently in the breeze. That weekend, I got a letter in the mail. No return address on the envelope, but the handwriting looked familiar. Inside was a folded note from Matt, the cousin who'd emailed me earlier. He wrote, "I didn't go to the wedding. It didn't feel right pretending like none of it mattered. I always noticed how hard you worked. I'm sorry you were treated that way. If you ever want to catch up, I'd like that." I kept the note. That evening I called him. We talked for a while. Nothing big, just work, weather, family. It felt easy, like there was space again for things that didn't carry weight. Later that week, I had a consultation with a new couple, Jillian and Theo. They'd filled out my intake form in full detail, brought a binder of ideas, and showed up on time. As I was reviewing my proposal, Theo interrupted me gently and said, "We've already seen your work. We're just hoping you'll take us on." I smiled, said I'd think about it, but I already knew I would. That night after I got home, I pulled out my notebook and started jotting down ideas. Not just about Jillian and Theo's wedding, but about the business itself, what I wanted it to feel like, who I wanted it to serve. I didn't just want tighter contracts or better screening. I wanted to build something with more heart, more clarity. I started sketching out a small team. Not a big agency, just a few trusted people who could help with events when things got busy. I thought about the assistants I could train the second shooters. I could mentor the coordinators. I could trust to carry the same level of care into a room. Word spread slowly, but it spread. By the end of the year, I was booked out through next spring. I wasn't chasing clients. I wasn't answering last-minute texts from anyone asking for discounts. I was building something on my own terms, and people respected it. One weekend, I was invited to photograph a retirement party for a local judge. The event was held at a historic inn just outside the city. Everything about it was simple, but thoughtful floral touches, hand-picked music, a dinner menu built around the guest of honor's favorite dishes. Toward the end of the evening, one of the speakers raised a glass and said, "Respect is how people speak your name when you're not in the room." I wrote that line down in my planner the next morning. Then I underlined it. 2 days later, I got a message from one of my longtime clients. She and her wife had just welcomed a baby girl and wanted me to photograph their first portraits as a family. "You're part of our story now," she wrote. "Not just our wedding planner, your family." By the time spring rolled around, the old weight had thinned out. Not all gone, but light enough to carry without strain. I hadn't heard from Lindsay, and I didn't expect to, but I wasn't waiting anymore either. My parents had sent a few quiet messages, a photo of a rose bush blooming in the backyard, a brief weather update. Nothing deep, but not silence either. That felt like enough for now. One night, Natalie and I were walking back from dinner when she asked, "Do you think things would have turned out like this if you hadn't said no?" I didn't answer right away. But a few blocks later, I said no. It changed everything. And it had. About 2 months after that conversation with Natalie, I got a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was soft, unsure. "We were wondering if maybe you'd want to meet for coffee," she said. "Just to talk." My father's voice followed. "Family should find a way to work things out." I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit for a few days before playing it again. It was quiet in the house when I did just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. After it finished, I called Natalie and read the whole thing aloud. She waited until I was done, then asked, "Do you want to see them?" I didn't answer at first. I brought it up in therapy the following week. We talked about boundaries, about what I would need, not just to go, but to leave the conversation intact. I made a short list. I needed acknowledgement, not just of the wedding, but of the years before it. I needed recognition for the work I had done, not as a gesture of praise, but as proof that it happened. And I needed some small, honest sign that they understood things couldn't go back to the way they were. Once I had those things clear in my head, I felt ready. I texted my mom and suggested a neutral place, a small cafe halfway between our homes with outdoor seating. I picked a table under the awning and got there 10 minutes early. The sky was gray and the breeze carried that soft dampness Portland always seemed to hold in early spring. They arrived together. My mom smiled first. My dad gave a quiet nod. We sat down without much small talk. "Thank you for meeting us," my mom said. "We weren't sure you'd answer." I told her I needed time. She nodded. We placed our coffee orders and waited until they arrived. Then my dad cleared his throat and said, "We didn't handle things well, especially around the wedding." My mom looked down at her hands. "I think we underestimated how much you'd done," she said. "Or maybe we just didn't let ourselves see it." I stayed quiet and let the space between us stretch a little. "You gave more than we realized," she continued. "Not just money, all of it." She looked up then. "I'm sorry for how that ended." I nodded, let the words settle. Then I told them something I hadn't said out loud to them before, that the wedding wasn't the beginning, it was the last line in a long chapter, that I'd spent years trying to earn something I never quite knew how to name. My mom nodded slowly. "We talked to your Aunt Barbara," she said. "She told us she supported your decision not to go. At the time I was upset, but now I think I understand." There was a pause, a different kind of quiet this time. "You were trying to give Lindsay something you never got," she said. "And we didn't make room for you in the process." That landed heavier than I expected. I looked at her face, and for a moment there was something there, something close to recognition. We didn't talk about Lindsay directly, but my father did mention that things with Graham's family hadn't turned out the way she thought they would. "They're a little more formal than she expected," he said. It's been difficult. I didn't ask for more. Before we parted, I told them I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't ready to step back into the same rhythm we'd had before. My mom reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over mine. "We're willing to rebuild," she said, "if that's something you want." I didn't make any promises, but I said I was open to keeping in touch, slowly, on terms that felt fair. We exchanged quiet goodbyes, and walked back to our cars in separate directions. I sat in mine for a few minutes before starting the engine. There were no tears, no replaying of the conversation, just a kind of steady quiet. That night, I cleared my schedule for the rest of the week. No double bookings, no shifting meetings to make room for someone else. For the first time in a long time, I made space just for myself. A few weeks later, I ran into Marissa Benton at a professional networking event. She'd been one of the early vendors I'd lined up for Lindsay's wedding, high-end rental specialty lighting, all of it canceled when I pulled out. She greeted me with a hug and leaned in. "I heard the country club ended up handling everything on their own," she said quietly. "Did your sister ever realize what she gave up?" I gave a small smile but didn't answer. Later that week, Marissa forwarded me a few photos someone had uploaded from the wedding. I opened the link on my tablet. The setup was simple, no design flourishes, no statement pieces, no visual cohesion, just tables and chairs, banquet lighting, and a standard buffet line. Lindsay and Graham stood beneath a ceiling fixture with harsh downlight, their expressions caught mid-motion. I closed the folder after a few minutes and didn't open it again. That weekend, I received a thank you message from Amanda Ellis, the floral designer from Crescent Harbor. She was working a different event there and wanted to say how much she appreciated the original introduction. "Still one of the best venues I've had the chance to work," she wrote. I read her message and thought back to how carefully I had stitched together that wedding. How much attention went into the timeline, the layout, the details that would never be seen now. It was hard to imagine that version of the day ever existing. But something else stayed with me even more. That Monday, I checked the mailbox and found a hand-addressed envelope from Matt. Inside was a short note. "You probably don't remember," he wrote, "but you helped me pick out a college major at Grandma's house once. Everyone else had moved on to dessert, and you asked what I liked. I never told you this, but it made a difference. I sat with that letter for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I wanted to carry forward. I carried it forward in small, steady ways. I kept my calendar honest, no double bookings, no quiet resentments, and I said yes only when I could show up fully. At work, I stuck to the new intake process and chose clients who valued partnership. At home, I cleared the last of the wedding scraps from my drawers and made room for simpler things: a fresh notebook, a film roll for my old camera, a clean coffee mug I actually liked using in the morning. My parents and I found a rhythm that didn't ask more than either of us could give. Some weekends, I stopped by their house for an hour. My dad pointed out the rose bush he'd nursed back after a hard frost, and my mom sent me home with leftovers in a neat stack of containers. We didn't relive what had happened or circle what hadn't. We let ordinary moments do quiet work, short conversations on the porch, a loose step that got fixed. A recipe card passed across the table. I didn't hear from Lindsay. News about her reached me in soft pieces through Aunt Barbara and the pauses in my parents' sentences. I let the information pass through and didn't hold on to it. There was no anger left to spend, and there was no open door I was willing to pretend existed. Some distances protect the ground you've just learned to stand on. Natalie stayed close. We walked the waterfront on weekday evenings and split a sandwich on a bench when the weather held. She never pushed me to talk, but she made room when I did. One night she said, "You built a different life without burning the old one down." I didn't answer at first. Then I said, "That was the only way I knew to keep the good parts." We sat there a little longer, the water slipping dark under the pier. Work grew in a sensible way. Jillian and Theo's wedding went smoothly, and their parents sent a thank you note that I pinned above my desk. My small team learned to read a room the way breath finds a rhythm, no showy moves, just care and timing. When a new planner asked how to set boundaries without losing clients, I told her, "You won't lose the right ones. The right ones will be grateful you have them." My cousin Matt sent a photo of his new apartment, bare walls, a plant in the window, a stack of books on the floor. He wrote 2 lines. "You were right about choosing what you enjoy. It holds." I printed it and tucked it inside my planner. Spring came early that year. On a cool evening, I sat in the small garden behind my house, with the porch light off and the wind chime moving just enough to be heard. I thought about the version of myself who was always reaching, and the long stretch of days it took to set that reach down. I didn't get a grand apology or a perfect reckoning. What I got was steadier a life that didn't ask me to disappear to keep the peace. If there's a lesson I can offer, it's this: saying no is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it is the doorway back to it love for the part of you that has been waiting to be treated with the same care you give to everyone else. Justice doesn't always arrive as a headline moment. Often it comes as a series of choices that return you to your own name, your own time, your own kitchen on a quiet night. I still believe in kindness. I believe in repair when both sides can stand on level ground and look each other in the eye. And I believe in the kind of dignity that doesn't require an audience. The day I chose peace over proximity, my life didn't end. It began to make sense. If this story touched something you've lived through, I'd be honored to hear your reflections. Tell me where you're listening from, share your own turning point if you'd like, and if these stories keep you company, feel free to stay for the next one.